I was 20 years old when I climbed into that top turret for the first time over Berlin, and I can still feel the way my hands shook so hard I could barely grip the twin 50 caliber Brownings that were supposed to keep us alive. My name was Staff Sergeant Michael Holland, and I was the top turret gunner on a B-17G flying fortress called Devil's Advocate that flew out of Thorpe Abbotts in England with the 100th Bomb Group. And what I saw through that plexiglass dome at 25,000 feet over Germany in January of 1945 still wakes me up most nights, even though I'm 78 years old now, and the war ended before most people reading this were even born. The training they gave us at Laredo Army Airfield in Texas was thorough. I'll give them that. But nothing prepares you for the reality of being suspended in a rotating glass bubble 7 miles above the earth, while German fighters come screaming at you at a combined closing speed of over 500 miles per hour. They taught us how to lead the target, how to conserve ammunition, how to clear a jam in 30 seconds with frozen fingers, but they never taught us how to deal with the fact that you're essentially sitting in a fishbowl made of quarter-inch plexiglass, while 20mm cannon shells are trying to find you, and the only thing between you and a 30,000-foot fall is a thin metal floor and a safety harness you pray holds if the plane gets hit. Our crew had been together since phase training at MacDill Field in Florida, and we'd flown 17 missions before that day over Berlin, which sounds like a lot until you realize that the 8th Air Force average life expectancy for a bomber crew was somewhere around 15 missions, so we were already living on borrowed time. Our pilot was Captain James Morrison from Des Moines, a farm kid who could hold a damaged plane steady like he was driving a tractor through a field, and our co-pilot was Lieutenant Danny O'Brien from Boston, who had this nervous habit of tapping his fingers on the yoke that drove Morrison crazy, but somehow helped him stay focused when things got bad. The navigator was Lieutenant Frank Chen, a second-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco, who could plot a course through cloud cover and flak that seemed impossible. And our bombardier was Second Lieutenant Robert Hayes from Atlanta, who had this weird calm about him when he was in the nose looking through the Norden bomb site, like the entire war condensed into one moment of mathematical certainty. Below me in the radio room was Technical Sergeant Earl Jackson from Detroit, who kept us connected to the world and could fix anything electronic, even with half the equipment blown to hell. And in the ball turret beneath the plane was Staff Sergeant Tommy Ricci from Newark, probably the bravest or craziest guy I ever met, because he'd climb into that rotating sphere knowing he couldn't get out without help if we got hit. The waist gunners were Staff Sergeant William Duke Morrison from Wyoming, no relation to our pilot, and Staff Sergeant James Parker from Philadelphia, both of them built like linebackers and needing every ounce of that strength to handle the 50 cows in the freezing wind that screamed through the open waist windows. And finally in the tail, watching our 6 o'clock like his life depended on it, which it absolutely did, was Staff Sergeant Anthony DeLuca from Brooklyn, who had already been credited with 2 confirmed kills and 1 probable before that mission, and who had this way of calling out bandits over the interphone that was simultaneously terrifying and reassuring because you knew he was paying attention. The briefing for the Berlin mission came at 400 hours on January 18th, and I remember the collective groan that went through the room when Major Phillips pulled back the curtain and we saw that red line stretching all the way across the map of Germany, because Berlin meant maximum fighter opposition, heavy flak, and a round trip of nearly 1,200 miles, most of it over occupied territory, where a bailout meant either death or capture, neither of which sounded appealing when you were 20 years old and still believed you might actually make it home. Phillips told us we'd be hitting the railway marshalling yards in the Tempelhof district, part of the larger effort to cripple German logistics before the final push into Germany that everybody knew was coming but nobody wanted to talk about, because that meant we'd still be flying these missions while the Russians closed in from the east. We were assigned to the lead squadron of the High Group, which meant we'd be out front and above the main formation, a position that offered slightly better visibility, but also made us a priority target for German fighters who knew that disrupting the lead plane could scatter the entire formation and reduce bombing accuracy. Our loadout was 10 500-pound general-purpose bombs, total weight 4,800 pounds, which sounds like a lot until you realize we're hauling them through 6 hours of enemy territory while fighters try to blow us out of the sky and flak tries to do the same thing from below. And every pound of bombs is a pound less fuel we can carry for the trip home. The wake-up call had come at 0300, and I'd forced down the powdered eggs and toast that passed for breakfast, while trying not to think about the fact that this was our 18th mission, and the odds were increasingly stacked against us completing our 25-mission tour. The equipment check took an hour, and I went over every inch of those twin 50s with a detail that bordered on obsessive, checking the belt feeds, testing the charging handles, making sure the gun heaters were working, because at altitude those guns could freeze solid in minutes if the heaters failed. And a jammed gun in combat meant you were basically a sitting duck in a glass cage. The walk to the hardstand where Devil's Advocate was parked felt longer than usual that morning, and I remember the way the ground fog clung to the runway and made the whole airfield look like something out of a ghost story, and maybe that should have been an omen, but we'd seen enough bad omens by then that we just ignored them and focused on the job. Morrison did his walk around while O'Brien went through the checklist, and I climbed up through the hatch into the radio room and then up the narrow ladder into my turret position, settling into the seat and connecting my oxygen mask, throat microphone, and heated suit plugs before rotating the turret through its full range to make sure everything moved smoothly. The engines fired up one by one, starting with number 3, then 4, 2, and 1 each right R-1820 Cyclone radial coughing blue smoke, before settling into that deep rumble that you felt in your chest more than heard, and the whole plane vibrated with barely contained power as Morrison ran through the magneto checks and watched the cylinder head temperatures climb into the green. At 06:27 hours we started taxiing, falling into line behind the other fortresses that were rolling toward the active runway, like a funeral procession of olive-drab steel and glass, each one carrying 10 young men who were trying not to think too hard about the fact that, statistically, some of them wouldn't be coming back. We lifted off at 0641, heavy with fuel and bombs, and Morrison needed every foot of that runway to get us airborne, the end of the concrete disappearing beneath us with maybe 50 feet to spare, and then we were climbing slowly through the overcast while trying to find our position in the formation, which was always a nightmare of near misses and throttle adjustments, as dozens of bombers tried to assemble in limited visibility while burning precious fuel and knowing that the longer it took, the more time the Germans had to prepare a reception committee. We broke through the cloud layer at 8,000 feet and found our slot in the formation, tucking in tight with the other planes in our squadron while the group formed up around us, and I rotated my turret continuously, scanning the sky in sectors the way they'd taught us, looking for the glint of sunlight on a canopy or the dark speck that grew larger with terrifying speed that meant a fighter was making a pass. The temperature at altitude was minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, and even with the heated suit, my fingers went numb if I didn't flex them constantly, and my breath frosted the inside of my oxygen mask until I had to wipe it clear every few minutes to keep breathing. The flight across the channel was uneventful, which gave us false hope that maybe this one would be a milk run, but that hope died as soon as we crossed into Dutch airspace and the first flak started coming up, black puffs of smoke that blossomed at our altitude with mathematical precision, because the German 88mm and 105-meter guns were directed by radar now, not just visual spotting, and they could bracket a formation with terrifying accuracy. The flak was light at first, just probing fire to gauge our altitude and heading, but I knew from experience that it would get heavier as we penetrated deeper into Germany, and the really intense stuff would start when we got within 50 miles of Berlin. We crossed into German airspace at 8:43 hours, and Chen kept us on course despite the buffeting from the flak that was now coming up in earnest, the concussions rocking the plane and filling the air with shrapnel that you couldn't see but could hear pinging off the fuselage like deadly hail. Morrison held her steady while O'Brien called out the flak positions, and Hayes in the nose was already setting up for the bomb run, even though we were still an hour away from the target, because at 25,000 feet traveling at 180 miles per hour, you had to think way ahead of where you actually were. The first fighters showed up at 0917 hours, about 30 miles inside Germany, and DeLuca called them out from the tail with that distinctive Brooklyn accent that somehow made the terror more bearable. Bandit 6 o'clock level, looks like 109s, 4 of them, closing fast. I rotated my turret to the rear quadrant and saw them. 4 Messerschmitt Bf-109Gs in finger 4 formation, still about 2 miles out, but closing at a combined speed that meant they'd be in range in less than 30 seconds. And I flipped the gun switch to fire, and felt my heart hammering in my chest like it was trying to break through my ribs. The 109 split up about 1,000 yards out, two going high and two going low, a classic bounce pattern designed to divide our defensive fire, and I tracked the high pair while DeLuca and the waist gunners took the low pair, and I remember thinking with crystal clarity that this was it. This was the moment where everything we'd trained for either worked or didn't, and there was no middle ground at 25,000 feet, with fighters coming in at 400 miles per hour. I opened up at 600 yards, long bursts from both 50s, watching the tracers arc out toward the lead 109, trying to walk them onto the target as he started his attack run, and I could see the flicker of his wing guns as he returned fire, orange muzzle flashes that meant 20mm cannon, and 30mm machine guns were sending rounds our way. The first 109 flashed past so close I could see the pilot's face behind his goggles, and my rounds chewed into his left wing, pieces of metal spinning away in the slipstream. But he didn't go down, just rolled away to the right, trailing smoke while his wingman came straight through, and I rotated hard to track him, firing another burst that went high because I hadn't led enough, and then he was past us and diving away while the second pair came in from below, and I could hear Duke and Parker firing from the waist and Ricci calling hits from the ball turret, and the whole plane shook with the recoil of 650 caliber machine guns firing at once. Morrison threw us into a slight banking turn to give the waist gunners a better angle, and I felt my stomach drop as the plane tilted and I was suddenly looking almost straight down at Germany from my rotating glass bubble, brown and green fields checkered with snow. And I thought about what it would be like to fall through all that empty air if we got hit. But then the formation straightened out and the 109s were gone, diving away to rearm and refuel, and we had maybe 10 minutes before the next group showed up. Turret to crew, I think I got some hits on that first 109, but no confirm, I called over the interphone, and Morrison acknowledged with a calm, "Roger that, stay sharp, Mike, we got a long way to go." And I rotated back to scanning sectors, looking for the next threat that I knew was coming, because the Luftwaffe never sent just one wave when you were going to Berlin. My ammunition counter showed I'd fired about 200 rounds, which meant I had 1,600 left, and I made a mental note to be more conservative with my fire, because running out of ammunition over Germany was a death sentence for the whole crew. The second wave came at 09:34, and this time it was a mixed group, 4 Bf-109s and 3 Fw-190s, and the 190s were the ones that made my blood run cold because they were tougher, faster, and carried heavier armament than the 109s, and their pilots tended to be more experienced, because the Germans were putting their best people in their best planes. DeLuca called them out at the same time Duke spotted them from the waist. Multiple bandits 9 o'clock high and 3 o'clock level, count 7, mixed 109s and 190s, and they look like they mean business. The 109s came in from 9 o'clock, targeting the planes on the left side of our formation, while the 190s set up for head-on attacks, the most dangerous kind, because a B-17's frontal firepower was limited to just the nose guns and top turret if you could rotate fast enough, and a determined pilot could put a lot of rounds into the cockpit and nose before breaking off. I rotated forward and elevated my guns, tracking the lead 190 as he came in from 1 o'clock high, his nose lit up with gun flashes, and I opened up at 700 yards, long steady bursts aimed at the point where I calculated he'd be by the time my rounds reached him, and I could see my tracers converging with his flight path. The 190 shuddered as my rounds hit, probably the engine cowling or wing root, and he pulled up sharply to avoid a collision, passing about 50 feet over our nose while his wingman came in right behind him, and I was already tracking the second one, firing another long burst that depleted my ammunition faster than I wanted, but I could see pieces flying off his port wing, and then he rolled inverted and dove away, trailing smoke and coolant, and Hayes called over the interphone, "Nice shooting. Mike, you got him." But I didn't have time to feel good about it because the third 190 was already making his pass from 2 o'clock. This one was different, more cautious, staying out at about 800 yards and firing his 20mm cannons in short, precise bursts, and I could see the rounds exploding around us. Bright orange flashes that looked harmless until one hit our number 3 engine, and suddenly we had smoke pouring from the cowling, and Morrison was calling feather 3, and O'Brien was shutting down the engine and adjusting power on the remaining 3 to keep us in formation. A B-17 could fly on 3 engines, even 2 if you were lucky and light, but it meant we were vulnerable now, wounded, and the German pilots could smell blood in the water like sharks. The formation tightened up around us, the other planes moving in closer to fill the gap and make it harder for fighters to single us out, and I kept scanning while checking my ammunition and seeing that I was down to 1,200 rounds, which sounded like a lot, but went fast when you were in continuous combat. The flak had stopped for a moment while the fighters made their passes, because even the Germans didn't want to shoot down their own planes. But I knew it would start up again as soon as the fighters cleared out, and we still had 30 miles to go before we reached Berlin and could drop our bombs and turn for home. Navigator to pilot. "We're 14 minutes from IP, stay on this heading," Chen called, and Morrison acknowledged while O'Brien monitored the engine temperatures and pressures, making sure our 3 remaining engines could handle the load, and I could feel the plane struggling a bit. Not quite as stable as before, the asymmetric thrust pulling us slightly to the left until Morrison compensated with rudder trim. Flying in formation on 3 engines took skill and constant attention, and I was grateful we had Morrison in the left seat because he was one of the best pilots in the group, which is probably why we'd made it to 18 missions when so many others hadn't. The third fighter wave came at 0951, and this time it was all Fw-190s, 8 of them in 2 swarms of 4, and they were positioned perfectly, altitude advantage, sun behind them, and they came in with a coordination that spoke of experienced pilots and good tactical planning. DeLuca spotted them first. "Bandit 6 o'clock high, 8-190s, 2 groups. They're setting up for a diving pass. This is going to be bad." And I rotated to the rear quadrant and elevated to maximum, trying to get an angle on them as they positioned for their attack. They split at the last moment, 4 going for our squadron and 4 targeting the low group. And the lead 1-90 came screaming down at an angle that looked almost vertical, his speed building rapidly as he dove, and I tracked him as best I could, but at that closing speed and angle it was almost impossible to lead properly. And I fired anyway, long burst, watching my tracers arc up toward him, but he was already firing his 20mm and 13mm guns, and I saw the flashes and knew we were about to take hits. The rounds walked across our right wing, punching holes in the aluminum skin with sharp metallic bangs that I could hear even through my leather helmet and the engine noise, and then something hit the fuselage near the waist, and Parker was screaming, we're hit, Duke's down." And I couldn't leave my guns to help because the second 190 was already making his pass, and I rotated hard to track him, firing another burst that went wide because I overcorrected, and he flashed past close, enough that I could see the black and white fuselage bands, and the yellow nose that marked him as part of JG-26, one of the elite fighter units. Morrison held the plane steady despite the damage, and O'Brien was on the interphone calling for damage reports, while Jackson checked the electrical systems, and Hayes tried to see the extent of the wing damage from the nose, and Ricci called up from the ball turret that he could see fluid streaming from the right wing, probably hydraulic or fuel, and that was bad, because it meant we were leaving a trail for other fighters to follow. Duke came back on the interphone after about 30 seconds, his voice shaky. "I'm okay, took some shrapnel in the leg, but I can still shoot. Parker's patching me up." And I felt relief mixed with anger, because this was supposed to be a precision bombing mission, not a running gunfight across Germany. The 4th 190 in the first group made a beam attack from 3 o'clock, coming in perpendicular to our flight path, and I rotated hard to get an angle, but he was mostly blocked by our own wing, and Parker opened up from the waist window, his tracers converging with the fighter's flight path. And I saw strikes on the 190's fuselage, bright sparks as armor-piercing rounds punched through the thin aluminum skin, and the fighter wobbled and pulled away, trailing smoke. But I didn't see him go down, so I couldn't claim him as a kill. The second group of 4 190s made their passes on the low group, and I watched them tear through the formation, their cannons flashing, and I saw one B-17 drop out with its number 4 engine on fire, the crew probably fighting to keep control while deciding whether to bail out or try to make it home. And I thought about the fact that those were guys just like us, 20 years old and scared and just trying to survive long enough to complete their tour. The damaged fort fell away to the right, losing altitude rapidly, and I counted 3 parachutes blossoming against the grey clouds below before I had to focus back on my own survival, because 2 more 190s were setting up for another pass. These 2 came in together, one from 11 o'clock and one from 1 o'clock, a coordinated pincer attack designed to overwhelm our forward defenses, and I had to make a split-second decision about which one to engage because I couldn't shoot at both simultaneously. I chose the 1 o'clock fighter, because he was slightly closer. And I opened up at 600 yards, leading him by about 3 plane lengths, and my rounds tracked across his nose, and I saw his propeller explode in a shower of metal fragments, the fighter yawing hard to the right as the engine seized, and the prop windmilled uselessly. The pilot tried to pull up, but his engine was dead, and his airspeed was bleeding off rapidly, and I watched him roll inverted and dive away, probably planning to glide as far as he could before bailing out, or trying for a dead stick landing, and Hayes confirmed, "Turret got one, I saw the prop come apart, he's going down," and I should have felt triumph, but all I felt was exhaustion, and the knowledge that there were still more fighters out there, and we had 50 miles of Germany left to cross. The 11 o'clock fighter pressed his attack while I was engaged with the first one, and his 20-millimeter rounds punched through our nose compartment, and Hayes was shouting, "I'm hit, I'm hit," and Morrison was calling, "How bad, how bad?" And Hayes came back with, "Took one in the shoulder, I'm bleeding, but I can still work the bomb site, we're almost at IP." And his voice had that tight quality that meant he was in serious pain, but functioning on pure adrenaline and training. Jackson came forward to help patch Hayes up as best he could, while we approached the initial point where we'd make our final turn to the bomb run, and I kept scanning for more fighters, knowing they'd be back because we were getting close to Berlin, and they'd make one more maximum effort to break up our formation before we could drop our bombs. The flak started up again at 09:58, heavier than before, and I could see the black bursts walking toward us in precise patterns, the German gunners getting our range and altitude dialed in perfectly, and Morrison had to hold us steady despite the flak, because we were on the bomb run now, and any evasive maneuvers would throw off Hayes's calculations on the Norden site. Each burst of flak sounded like someone hitting the fuselage with a giant hammer, the concussion wave rocking the plane, and I could hear shrapnel rattling against the metal skin like deadly rain, and pieces of plexiglass cracked in my turret dome, spiderweb fractures spreading across my field of view. "Bombardier to pilot. I've got the aircraft, I'm on the bomb run," Hayes called, his voice strained with pain. And Morrison acknowledged, "Your airplane." And now Hayes was in control through the Norden bomb site's linkage to the autopilot, making tiny adjustments to keep us on target while I rotated my turret and watched the sky, knowing that the next few minutes would be the most dangerous of the entire mission because we couldn't maneuver, and every German fighter pilot and flak gunner in Berlin knew exactly where we were and where we were going. The 5th fighter wave came at 1003, right in the middle of our bomb run, and it was the biggest yet, at least 12 Fw-190s and several Bf-109s, and they came in from every angle at once, a coordinated massed attack designed to break our formation and force us off target. And I opened up on the closest 190, firing burst after burst while trying to conserve ammunition, and the sky around us filled with tracers going in both directions, red from the German fighters and white from our guns, and the whole world condensed down to the gun sight and the target, and the recoil of the 50s vibrating through my entire body. 190 came straight up through the formation from below, probably climbing at full throttle, and Ricci nailed him from the ball turret, his rounds ripping into the fighter's belly where the armor was thinnest, and the 190 exploded in a fireball that flashed past our nose close enough that I felt the heat even through the plexiglass, and burning debris tumbled away behind us while Ricci called, "Scratch 190, he's not going to make it home." And his voice had that manic edge that came from being trapped in a rotating ball underneath a bomber while fighters tried to kill you. Another 190 made a head-on pass, his cannons flickering, and I tracked him and fired, and my rounds converged with his flight path at about 400 yards, and I saw strikes all along his left wing and fuselage, pieces flying off in the slipstream, and he pulled up sharply and rolled away trailing smoke and possibly on fire, and that made 2 confirmed kills for me if he went down. But I didn't have time to think about it because 2 more were making beam attacks from both sides, simultaneously, and I had to choose which one to engage while hoping the waist gunners could handle the other. "Bombs away," Hayes called at 1006, and I felt the plane lift suddenly as 10 500-pound bombs dropped from the racks, and Morrison took back control and immediately put us into a slight banking turn to the left to clear the target area and join the rally point where the formation would reassemble for the flight home. The flak intensified for about 30 seconds as we crossed directly over the target, the German gunners giving us everything they had, and then we were through it and turning northwest toward the rally point, and the fighters broke off their attacks for a moment, probably low on ammunition and fuel, and needing to regroup before making another pass. I took the opportunity to check my ammunition counters and saw I was down to 800 rounds across both guns, which meant I'd fired almost 1,500 rounds in the last 15 minutes, and I knew I'd have to be much more selective with my fire on the flight home, because running out of ammunition would make us a priority target for German fighters who'd learned to identify which bombers were still shooting and which ones were defenseless. My hands were shaking from the adrenaline and cold, and my oxygen mask was frozen to my face, and I could taste blood in my mouth from biting my lip. But we were alive, and the bombs were gone, and now it was just a matter of surviving the flight home. The formation reformed at 10:14, missing 3 planes from our group, and we fell into our position in the high squadron, though we were lower now because we couldn't maintain altitude on 3 engines and with the damage we'd taken. Morrison had us at 22,000 feet instead of 25,000, which meant we were below the main formation, but still high enough to avoid most of the small arms fire from the ground, and we used the extra speed from the gradual descent to keep up with the formation despite our reduced power. The 6th fighter wave came at 10:31, about 40 miles west of Berlin, and these were different Me-262 jets, the first time I'd seen them in combat, and they came in so fast that I barely had time to get my guns on target before they flashed through the formation at over 500 miles per hour. The 262s didn't dogfight, they just made slashing attacks, fired their 30mm cannons in short bursts, and then used their speed to escape before we could track them, and I got off maybe 50 rounds at the first one, and I don't think a single round connected because the closing speed was just too high for me to lead properly. One 262 hit a fort in the low group, and I saw the 30mm rounds explode along the fuselage like a string of firecrackers, and the entire tail section separated from the plane, just sheared off by the impact of those massive shells, and the fort went into a flat spin with the crew trapped inside, because at that rotation rate the centrifugal force would make it impossible to reach the hatches, and I watched it spin down through 10,000 feet of empty air before I had to look away because there was nothing we could do for them. The 262s made 3 passes, each one taking out at least 1 bomber, and then they were gone, probably returning to their base because those jets sucked fuel at an incredible rate and didn't have the range to stay with us all the way to the French border. After they left, the conventional fighters came back, smaller groups now, 4 or 5 planes at a time, making harassing attacks but not the coordinated massed assaults we'd faced over Berlin, and I engaged each one as they came within range, firing short bursts to conserve ammunition, trying to damage them enough to make them break off their attacks without necessarily shooting them down. At 10:47, 2 Fw-190s made a diving attack from 7 o'clock high, and DeLuca called them out and opened up with his twin 50s, but they came in fast and with good tactics, one slightly behind and above the other, so if DeLuca focused on the leader, the wingman had a clear shot. I rotated to the rear quarter and elevated as high as my turret would go, and I engaged the trailing 190 at about 500 yards, firing a long burst that started low and walked up his fuselage as he descended, and I saw my tracers chewing into his cockpit area, the canopy shattering, and the fighter suddenly rolled hard to the left and went inverted, and I knew I'd either killed or badly wounded the pilot because the plane fell away out of control with pieces coming off in the slipstream. DeLuca got the lead 190 with a perfect deflection shot, his rounds tearing into the fighter's engine, and it exploded in a ball of orange fire and black smoke, and DeLuca's voice came over the interphone calm as if he was ordering coffee. "Splash 190. That's 3 confirmed for me now. How you doing up there, Mike?" And I told him I thought I'd gotten the wingman, but couldn't confirm because I'd lost sight of him in the clouds below, and he said, "I saw him go in. Nice shooting, partner." And somehow that made me feel better, even though we were still 2 hours from home and down to about 600 rounds of ammunition. The fighters tapered off as we crossed into France, occasional single-plane attacks, but nothing sustained, because the German pilots were probably low on fuel and ammunition, and they'd already accomplished their mission of making us pay dearly for bombing Berlin. We'd lost 9 planes from the group, 90 men either dead or prisoners or on the run in occupied territory, and every surviving plane was damaged to some degree, some worse than others, but all of us flying aircraft that had holes in the wings and fuselage and systems that were barely functional. Our hydraulic system was shot, which meant we'd have to crank the landing gear down manually, and we had no brakes, and our number 3 engine was completely dead, and number 4 was running rough. So we were basically limping home on 2.5 engines while hoping we didn't run out of fuel before we reached England. Chen plotted us a course that would take us over the channel at the narrowest point, and Morrison coaxed every bit of performance he could out of the remaining engines, while O'Brien watched the fuel gauges and calculated whether we'd make it or have to ditch in the channel, which in January meant hypothermia would kill you in about 15 minutes, even if you survived the ditching. We crossed the French coast at 11:47, and I could see the white cliffs of Dover ahead, and I felt a surge of relief that we'd made it this far, but I knew we still had to land this damaged aircraft, and with no hydraulics and 1 working engine on each wing, that meant Morrison would have to thread the needle perfectly, or we'd crash on landing and probably burn because we were still carrying about 400 gallons of fuel that was sloshing around in tanks that had probably been perforated by shrapnel or gunfire. Hayes had lost a lot of blood, and Jackson had him wrapped in every blanket we could find while trying to keep pressure on his shoulder wound, and Duke was hurting bad from the shrapnel in his leg. But he'd stayed at his gun until we cleared the French coast, because that's what you did. You stayed at your position until you were either dead or safe, and safe didn't come until you were on the ground in England. Ricci had climbed out of the ball turret as soon as we crossed the channel, because he couldn't get out on his own if we crashed, and he wanted to be able to jump if we had to bail out. And I didn't blame him, because that ball turret was a death trap if the plane went in. We reached Thorpe Abbotts at 12:37, and Morrison called the tower and told them we needed priority landing because we had wounded and major damage, and they cleared the runway and had the crash truck standing by, and I climbed down from my turret for the first time in almost 7 hours, and my legs nearly gave out from the cramping and cold. I made my way to the radio room and looked at Hayes, and saw how pale he was. His lips blue from blood loss and cold, and I knew he needed a hospital fast, or he wasn't going to make it. Morrison brought us in on final approach, with O'Brien working the manual landing gear crank, and I braced myself in the radio room doorway because I knew this landing was going to be rough, and I watched through the side window as the ground came up fast, too fast, and Morrison flared at the last second and we hit hard, the tail wheel touching first, and then the main gear slamming down with a jolt that rattled every bone in my body. And then we were rolling down the runway with no brakes, and Morrison was cutting the remaining engines and standing on the rudder pedals trying to steer. And we rolled and rolled until finally the plane slowed and stopped about 50 feet from the end of the runway. The ambulance was there in seconds, and they got Hayes out and into the vehicle while Duke hobbled out on his own, refusing a stretcher even though his leg was soaked with blood. And the rest of us climbed out and stood there looking at our plane, and I counted 73 holes in the fuselage and wings, and the right wing had a section of skin peeled back where a 20mm round had detonated against a spar, and the number 3 engine cowling was blackened from the fire. And I realized we'd been incredibly lucky to make it home at all. The debriefing was the usual routine, intelligence officers asking questions and filling out forms while we drank coffee and smoked cigarettes and tried to decompress from 7 hours of terror. And when they asked me about my gunnery, I told them I had 2 confirmed kills, both Fw-190s, one at about 400 yards during the approach to Berlin, and one at about 500 yards on the way home, and I'd probably damaged or destroyed 2 or 3 others, but couldn't confirm because I'd lost sight of them. They said they'd check with the other crews and gun camera footage if any survived, and let me know what was credited. But honestly, I didn't care about the numbers. I just wanted to sleep for about 24 hours and try to forget what I'd seen up there. Hayes made it through surgery, but they sent him home. His war was over after 18 missions. And Duke was back flying 2 weeks later with a limp he'd probably have for the rest of his life, and the rest of us went back up 4 days later in a different plane because Devil's Advocate was too damaged to repair and got scrapped for parts. We flew 7 more missions before the war ended, and each one was the same routine of terror and survival and watching friends die. And by the time we finished our tour in April, I was a different person from the 20-year-old kid who'd climbed into that turret back in November. I came home in May of 1945, and I tried to forget what I'd seen over Germany. But you don't forget things like that. They just sit inside you like a stone in your gut, and every time you close your eyes, you see those fighters coming at you with their guns flashing, or you see that B-17 with its tail shot off spinning down through the clouds, or you hear Hayes screaming over the interphone that he was hit. I didn't talk about any of it for 30 years, just buried it deep and tried to build a normal life, got married, had kids, worked as a machinist in Detroit, and nobody knew what I'd done in the war because I never told them. It was only when I met another 8th Air Force veteran at a VFW meeting in 1975 that I started talking about it. And once I started, I couldn't stop. And I realized that all those years I'd been carrying it alone when there were thousands of us who'd been through the same thing and understood in a way that nobody else could. We formed a little group, guys from different bomb groups and different crews, and we'd meet once a month and talk about the missions and the friends we'd lost and what it was like up there at 25,000 feet with fighters trying to kill you and flak bursting around you and knowing that any second could be your last. Morrison died in 1989 from a heart attack, O'Brien in 1994 from cancer, Chen in 2001 from complications of diabetes, and DeLuca in 2006 from pneumonia. And each one of their deaths hit me hard because we'd been through something together that bonded us closer than brothers. And losing them was like losing pieces of myself. Duke is still alive, living in Arizona with his grandkids, and we talk on the phone sometimes, and we don't have to say much because we both know what the other is thinking. We both still see those fighters coming at us, and we both still wonder why we made it when so many others didn't. I'm 78 years old now, and I can barely walk without a cane, and my hands shake from arthritis and probably from nerve damage from the cold and the vibration of those guns. But I can still remember every detail of that mission to Berlin in January of 1945, like it happened yesterday. I remember the way the twin 50s felt in my hands when I opened fire, the smell of cordite and hydraulic fluid and fear, the sound of DeLuca's voice calling out bandits over the interphone, the sight of those Fw-190s diving at us with their cannons flashing, and the moment when my rounds found their mark and one of them shuddered and fell away trailing smoke. I don't talk about it much anymore because most people don't want to hear war stories from an old man. But sometimes, when I'm alone at night and I can't sleep, I go back there in my mind, back to that glass turret at 25,000 feet over Germany, and I can see it all again like I'm still 20 years old and scared out of my mind, but doing my job anyway because that's what we did. We did our jobs and we looked out for each other. And somehow we survived when so many others didn't. And I think about those Fw-190 pilots I shot down, kids probably no older than me, and I wonder what their names were, and if they survived or if they died in the crashes, and I wonder if they had families that missed them, and if anyone remembers them now. And I carry that weight too, because in war there are no real winners, just survivors and the dead, and the survivors carry both with them for the rest of their lives.